Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adam Thomas, the Executive Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture this afternoon, which is being held under the auspices of both our America's Founding and Future lecture series and our special America 250 lecture series this year, which is being sponsored by the Jack Miller Center. For those of you who are not familiar with the James Madison Program, we are a program dedicated to exploring enduring questions of American constitutional law and Western political thought. If you would like to learn more about everything that we do, please visit our website at jmp.princeton.edu and follow us on X at Madison Program. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our Madison's Notes podcast, and learn more about all of our upcoming events, both virtual and in person. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jean Yarbrough, our lecturer this evening. Jean is Gary M. Pendy Senior Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Government at Bowdoin College, where she has taught political philosophy and American political thought for 37 years. She is the author of American Virtues, Thomas Jefferson, On the Character of a Free People, and Theodore Roosevelt and the American Political Tradition, which won the APSA Richard Neustadt Prize. She is a former president of the New England Political Science Association and has served on the National Council of the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's currently at work on a book project on Tocqueville and select American presidents. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Jack Miller Center and is titled Aristotle and Tocqueville on the Preservation of the American Republic at 250. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yarbrough.
Hello. It's a great pleasure to be here again at Princeton. I forget always how beautiful it is. It's particularly nice in the fall, as I'm sure it really is in every season. In any case, thank you for the invitation. I thank the Jack Miller Center, and I thank Robbie George and his James Madison program, and everyone else, Christy and Ralph, and all the people who got me here in one piece today, including the United Airlines pilot, because that is a big if these days, whether the planes will fly or not with the air traffic controllers. So I'm very happy to be here, and I hope I'll be happy to get home tomorrow. So my paper today is, as was just mentioned, on Aristotle and Tocqueville. By now, almost everyone has heard Benjamin Franklin's reply when asked what form of government the Philadelphia Convention had recommended. "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Yet despite how often Franklin is quoted, few have asked themselves what his warning really means. As we approach the semi-quincentennial, that's 250 years, of the founding of our republic, it is worth thinking about the dangers we currently face if we are to keep it. To be sure, there is no shortage of books and speeches offering advice, including the sage reflections of our most illustrious presidents, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. But today, I'd like to focus on two political philosophers, one ancient, one modern, whom I have found helpful in thinking about the question of preservation. My starting point for any such reflection must be Aristotle, especially books 5 and 6 of the Politics. These two books are not much read anymore, and that's the pity, because they contain a wealth of sound political advice. What's especially interesting is Aristotle's, at the beginning of Book 5, where he observes that before a regime is founded, it's important to know what destroys it. and then what preserves it. Only after he's discussed those two mirror opposites of each other does he then, in Book 6, take up the question of the founding. And his implication is clearly that without prior knowledge of the dangers facing a particular regime and how to prevent them, the regime is unlikely to last. Taken together, Books 5 and 6 point back to an earlier discussion in Book 3, with which more people are familiar. And here, Aristotle defines a regime as an arrangement of offices that promote a certain way of life. He then proceeds to classify them according to how many rule and to what end. So, when thinking about the preservation of the American way of life, it is good to begin by asking what kind of regime the founders wanted to establish. James Madison, writing as Publius in Federalist 39, echoes Benjamin Franklin when he observes that only a republic would suit the genius of the American people, its genius being its character and the principles for which the Americans had fought their revolution. We know from Madison's lengthy notes, prepared months before the convention, that he indeed had, as Aristotle recommended, studied the ways in which past popular governments had come to grief. The two greatest problems he saw were, first, the small size of the Greek republics, most of them smaller than many of our towns today. And second, that majority factions were all too frequently arose when citizens participated directly in government themselves with no checks on their power. Federalist 9 by Hamilton decries these petty republics, which Montesquieu sketched in The Spirit of the Laws, and these petty republics, as Montesquieu described them, were beloved by opponents of the Constitution. No political philosopher was cited more frequently in the debates over the Constitution than Montesquieu. Hamilton called these Greek republics wretched nurseries, swinging wildly between the extremes of anarchy and tyranny. With this understanding of the dangers of popular government, the framers could then address themselves to preventing these difficulties and ultimately to founding. The key to preservation, they thought, was to extend the sphere of government and to remove the people from a direct share in governing. In founding their new republic, the framers relied on modern improvements in the science of politics, especially a new kind of federalism that makes the large republic possible and representation essential. In the large republic they propose, there is no way that people can participate directly in politics except to vote for their representatives in a system that favors the selection of what they thought, or at least hoped, would be the most qualified. Reversing the ancient understanding that politics and to participate in politics was the great calling of a free citizen, Publius in Federalist 10 defines a republic, he does this 3 times in the Federalist Papers, defines a republic as a government in which a scheme of representation, not participation, takes place. So important is this modern discovery of representation that Thomas Jefferson could, after discussing this, dismiss all of Aristotle's thought as obsolete because he had not known about representation. Indeed, the extension of the representative principle to every branch of government, and not, as in England, to only the lower house of Parliament, is one reason that Publius could boast in Federalist 14 that the Americans had created a form of government that has no model on the face of the globe. While it is easy to see why the framers were so proud of their handiwork, we should not be too quick to dismiss Aristotle's analysis of what destroys various regimes. The primary reason most regimes fail is that they have a faulty understanding of justice. Justice, Aristotle argues, requires that we give to equals equally and to unequals unequally. But who decides who are the equals and in what way they are equal? Democrats think that because they are equal in the sense of being born free, they should be treated equally in all respects. Oligarchs, the wealthy, think that because they are unequal, they're richer, they should be treated unequally in everything. Each side fails to consider the other's position, and both sides ignore the claims of those who are unequal, that is, superior in wisdom and virtue. This is why justice cannot be left to these warring factions. It needs the guidance of political philosophy to sort out and moderate these conflicting claims. Nor, it turns out, does a large representative republic solve the problem of majority faction as much as Publius had hoped. Madison surely exaggerates when he claims that if every Athenian citizen had been a Socrates, the Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. Although representation does allow for greater deliberation than an assembly of citizens meeting in person, it still raises a question of what exactly is the role of the representative. Are they supposed to reflect the views and interests of their constituents, as several leading anti-federalists argued, and today's identitarians also insist? Or should they refine and enlarge those positions, as Publius argues? Is it even possible today to reflect all or even most views? If not, how far should representatives go in refining the views of their constituents before they are accused of disregarding their wishes altogether? To add to these difficulties, is each branch of our Republican government representative in the same way? Or, as Publius argues in Federalist 37, do the representatives of each branch bring something different that collectively makes up the sum of good government? These are questions that can also use the help of political philosophy to rise above the partisan fray. Aristotle, that master psychologist, can also help us understand the political passions that excite different social classes, endangering the regime. The poor are plagued by envy and resentment, which causes them to mistreat the wealthy and try to confiscate their property. The rich, on the other hand, tend to suffer from arrogance and contempt. They despise the poor and mistakenly think that because they're wealthy, they're also virtuous. Their hubris oppresses. The middle class largely avoids these evils, but it's not easy to create a stable middle class. There are also other problems that Aristotle highlights. Fear of punishment or retaliation by one side against the other can also destabilize a regime, as can the excessive desire for profit or for honor. So also can seemingly small things such as love affairs, sexual scandals, and family feuds. Democracies are also susceptible to unscrupulous leaders, demagogues, who stir up the people for their own selfish purposes, while oligarchies are prone to factions within themselves, to wanton living, and to lawsuits. It does not take much imagination to see how these passions continue to play out, not only in American politics, but in politics more generally. Pace Jefferson, when it comes to the core political dangers, Aristotle still has much to teach us. However, if we want to understand the particular dangers to which our modern democracy are prone, there is no better guide than Alexis de Tocqueville. Thinking it wise to absent himself from France after the fall of the Bourbon monarchy in 1830, the 26-year-old French aristocrat sailed from France with his traveling companion Gustave de Beaumont and landed in Newport, Rhode Island in May of 1831. He was here for 9 months. On the pretense of inspecting the American prison system, the two spent the next 9 months touring the United States, meeting with Americans, including President Andrew Jackson, whom Tocqueville in Democracy in America dumps all over, to put it nicely. They were not impressed. The first volume of Democracy in America, published in 1835, when Tocqueville was 29. 29, let that sink in for a minute, especially the fellows sitting in the front row. 29, this is pretty accomplished to get this major book written before he was 30. Tocqueville began by describing the pyramidal structure of the American Republic, starting with the New England township, where the people did govern themselves directly, unlike the highly centralized system in France. Tocqueville's focus on the township also differed from the analysis in the Federalist, which was only concerned with the structure of the federal government and its relationship to the states. But the Federalist was also more wary of direct citizen participation, especially in the aftermath of the American Revolution, when political passions still ran hot. Tocqueville, like Jefferson, was greatly impressed with the New England townships. Jefferson discovered them after they nearly broke his administration during the Embargo Act. He said they made the ground tremble beneath his feet. Tocqueville did not have so dramatic a view of them. He likened them to primary schools that nurtured citizens in the spirit of freedom. It was, he thought, the Americans' long political experience in conducting local affairs that equipped them for the higher task of choosing their representatives and holding them to account. Tocqueville found much to admire in this novel arrangement, which combined, in his view, the advantages of the small republics of antiquity and the large modern state. For this reason, he was more enthusiastic about the framers' invention of federalism than even the authors of the Federalist Papers themselves, and more enthusiastic still about local self-government and the wide range of opportunities it offered citizens to act together. At the same time, as a moderate friend of democracy, Tocqueville was singularly alert to the dangers facing the new democratic republic. And here I think it's really important to keep in mind that when Tocqueville comes to America in 1830, he has no real experience with democracy. The French Revolution had gone up in flames, and there were no other democracies in the world. And so he comes here to look at it because he thinks that democracy is providentially destined to rule in future years or centuries. This is a movement, he says, writes in the beginning of Democracy in America, that began in the 700s. So those of you who are looking for instant results should better look elsewhere. Democracy is a slow unfolding of political liberty and the granting of more political liberty to citizens. This doesn't happen overnight. And the only place to look to it in 1831 is to the United States. Tocqueville then both saw the advantages in the first volume of Democracy in America, describes our constitutional system. The longest chapter in the book is on the three races, which he says is American but not democratic because the Americans tyrannize, and he uses that word repeatedly, not only the slaves but also the native tribes. So in the first volume, he's explaining the institutional setup, how it works, how do the judges work? How does a Congress work? What is the Electoral College? And he will go on when the Orleanist monarchy falls in 1848 and the French set up their own Second French Republic, to be a member of their constitutional convention, and he will offer suggestions based on his own study of the American Republic. But he also was very alert to new dangers. These are dangers that you don't find in an aristocratic system. The aristocratic system has its own set of problems. But if you are looking at democracy, and by democracy he means a government that provides equality of condition. So he's not saying that all people are equal or equal in every respect, as Aristotle had said Democrats believe. What he's saying is we've wiped away all of the conventional distinctions, that's conventional hereditary distinctions. So no one is born a count or a duke or a member of the nobility. What's it like when the sky's the limit, that if you work hard, you can, if you are lucky and you have talent, you can rise as high as you can go. This is not something that was going on in Europe, where people were born into an hereditary class system. So this is the primary thing that he is stressing about democracy. But he has a number of, he foresees a number of dangers, and I'd like to list for you now 6 of them briefly. The first is national identity. Who are we as a country? What does it mean to be a nation? What is nationalism? In the concluding section of the first volume, Tocqueville takes up the question, will the republic last? By a republic, he means the tranquil but steady action of the people upon itself, which in turn requires a people schooled in the habits of liberty, who understand the difference between liberty and license. The American Republic, he writes, will last as long as it has people like those who founded the Republic, but challenges will come, either from an influx of immigrants who do not share the American love of liberty and the customs and laws that support it, or from a change in the character of the American people themselves, either of which will ultimately result in what he calls, quote, an entirely new people, end quote. Tocqueville also added that as yet the United States had no great cities, very Jeffersonian point, and predicted that the growth of such cities and, quote, the nature of their inhabitants, end quote, would pose a, quote, genuine danger to the future of democratic republics in the New World. We now face challenges on all 3 of these fronts. In the last 4 years, millions of immigrants from around the globe with no knowledge of America's laws and traditions have poured across our borders in numbers impossible, in Tocqueville's words, to digest, and clustered in the dark recesses of American cities, while a rising number of young college graduates, many also struggling to work and live in these cities, now think that socialism is superior to free enterprise and that even violence is acceptable in dealing with opposing views. As we have seen in recent days, many of these young college students are motivated, and not only them, are motivated by religious hatred, by which I mean principally anti-Semitism. These are not what Tocqueville called small party issues that are animating the body politic these days. Tocqueville distinguished between small parties and great parties. Small parties are when you worry about whether the sales tax is going up, the income tax is going down, things where you can sort of split the difference and come out, with some sort of compromise that satisfies most people. These are mostly economic questions. But there are also great party issues. Great party issues are ones that involve first principles that call into question the American way of life, or as Tocqueville puts it, America's very soul. Another problem, the second, is equality and liberty. We tend to think of them as great partners. We're equal and we're free. Equal rights is the term that sums up that nice union perfectly. But Tocqueville wasn't so sure that that's how it always works out. Democracy in America makes, as I mentioned earlier, equality of condition the distinguishing feature of democracy. Unlike Jefferson, who asserted that men are created equal in the possession of certain inalienable rights, I do think that Tocqueville believed that, but Tocqueville does not say that. These rights, it is the purpose of government to protect, and we know this from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. So it's to secure these rights, not to make us equal in other ways. So it's to secure rights. But Tocqueville doesn't talk about he never mentions the Declaration of Independence, and that has some political philosophers having a great big conniption. Did that mean he didn't believe in it? No, it just wasn't relevant to his experience in France, to give you a very short answer. But what Tocqueville does do in Democracy in America, and which the Declaration of Independence, being a declaration of war, really, and an explanation for why we're going to war, Tocqueville focuses on the psychological dynamic that governs the two. In theory, equality and liberty should be mutually reinforcing, but often they are not. As Tocqueville explains, democratic peoples love liberty. They have a, quote, natural taste for freedom, but they have, quote, an ardent, insatiable, eternal, invincible passion for equality. The unhappy truth is that if Democrats cannot have equality and freedom, they will sometimes prefer equality in slavery or servitude. And at the end of the first volume, he pits America against Russia as equality in liberty and equality in servitude. These are two different ways you can go. Everybody can be equal and no one can be free, or people can be both equal and free. But although he describes America as a country in which one can be equal and free, he is aware of this psychological tension between the two, because equality is the much stronger of the two passions. To be sure, equality can manifest itself, in his words, as a manly and legitimate passion that incites, quote, men to want all to be strong and esteemed. but it can also be depraved, leading the weak to want to draw the strong down to their level. What's more, the sublime pleasures, as he calls them, of freedom are difficult to assess, while the dangers brought on by too much freedom are immediately evident. By contrast, the charms of equality are readily apparent to all. They can be seen. They can be measured. You can measure equality because you can measure income. You can measure, all sorts of ways in which people are equal or unequal in material things. But the drawbacks of equality insinuate themselves only gradually and are not recognized until it is too late. Finally, it is possible to imagine a state in which citizens are content with the freedoms they enjoy, but, he says, men will never be satisfied with the degree of equality that they have. In fact, he anticipates what later becomes known as the revolution of rising expectations when he writes, in fact, the desire for equality always becomes more insatiable as equality is greater. To these dangers, Tocqueville adds one more, which may partly explain why the young are embracing socialism in greater numbers. Of course, what they learn in school has a great deal to do with this, and I'll get to that later. Once opinion begins to solidify, the pressure to conform becomes irresistible. For Tocqueville, the tyranny of the majority extends far beyond the economic interests that James Madison focused on in Federalist 10. Indeed, the loss of independent thinking is far more dangerous because it goes straight to the soul. And as someone who has for many, many years, as you were told already, taught at Bowdoin College, I can say that it's very difficult for young people to swim against the tide. You have all these apps that allow students to track each other and to make anonymous comments about each other, to make fun of them, to deride them, to degrade them, even to wish them harm or violence. This, I think, even more than wanting to please their professors, the pressures on young people to conform to the prevailing views in the classroom or on their campuses are really extreme, and it's very worrying. So independent thinking. Tocqueville at one point says there is no country in the world where freedom of thought is less evident than in the United States. So, so we shouldn't get all puffed up about how great we are, because there are some problems here, and that's what he wants. That's what I'm trying to focus on. After liberty and equality, there's another dynamic duo, as it were, and that is the twin evils of secularization and materialism. This may be the most philosophic of all the dangers, but I think I will explain it. And if not, you can ask me about it in the questions. Part of the reason that Americans have historically possessed such a strong sense of freedom is that, unlike the French, the Americans from their earliest beginning have combined the spirit of liberty with the spirit of religion. To be sure, Tocqueville makes it clear that Puritan theology has its bizarre and tyrannical aspects, but he also believes that Republican governments need religion. He's thinking here of Christianity. He does have comments that he makes about Islam and about Hinduism, but his overall point is that the basic religious creeds of a country help to shape the character of the people who live in those countries. The French, who during their revolution made war on religion, had seen their republic degenerate into a reign of terror. In their hostility to religion, French Enlightenment thinkers had led the country astray. Tocqueville writes, "Despotism can do without faith, but freedom cannot. Religion is most necessary when the people rule themselves. What," he asks, "makes a people master of itself if it has not submitted to God?" In other words, it sets limits to what he calls the impious maxim that the will of the people should prevail in every instance. Nevertheless, Tocqueville understands that the boundary between religion and politics is porous. Religion can restrain democratic excess, but democracy in its turn will gradually seep into religious doctrine, pressuring religions, different creeds, different denominations to become more democratic. Indeed, Tocqueville hints the dogma may have slipped the reins of religion altogether. The sovereignty of the people, he announces, has become the new democratic dogma to which even religion must submit. Yet even if, by the time of Tocqueville's visit, dogmatic belief about the immortality of the soul had lost its power for many denominations who have shifted the focus to Christian ethics here on this earth rather than the fate of their immortal souls, if they even believe in the fate of their immortal souls, religion continues to serve two valuable purposes. Not only does it restrain the tyrannical impulses of the majority, making freedom less dangerous, but it keeps Americans from embracing a full-fledged doctrine of materialism, which he regards, and I'm quoting here, as a dangerous malady of the human mind, particularly in a democratic people, because it combines so marvelously with their most familiar vice. What is that most familiar vice? Vulgar materialism. So you have philosophical materialism, and then you've got the vulgar version. These are your shopping centers, your downtown malls, your need to shop till you drop. This is vulgar materialism. We see it all around us. Fashion, cars, sailboats, motorboats, houses, everything got to be bigger, better, more. Everything is obsolete. This is vulgar materialism. But in America, we don't suffer. We do more today, but in Tocqueville's day, we don't suffer as much from philosophical materialism. What is philosophical materialism? It is the belief that Lucretius in De Rerum Natura articulated. It is the idea that human beings are nothing but matter in motion. Thomas Hobbes uses that phrase especially. That's all we are. If you are studying in philosophy or you have studied in philosophy, the mind-brain problem. You see, the soul disappears entirely. All you've got is the mind versus the brain. And the brain you can explain by biochemical reactions and all of that. But the brain, the mind, is still somewhat puzzling. Can material causes explain the higher workings of the mind? And for philosophic materialism, this is the goal. And Tocqueville is so opposed to this. Why, he argues, would you want to reduce human beings simply to matter in motion, to nothing more than the material functions of your body? This, he thinks, degrades human beings. And so philosophic materialism, which reduces us just to nothing more than our body weight and our various biochemical reactions in our brain, is a great, in his view, injustice and disservice to what it means to be a human being. What he warns against then is a thoroughgoing philosophical materialism, according to which human beings are, as I just said, matter in motion. Such a philosophy reduces human beings to the level of brutes, animate bodies without souls. It strips humanity of its higher immaterial longings. You could think love, especially the desire for immortality and the love of freedom. These things are immaterial. They're hard to pin down. The soul is notoriously hard to pin down. But these, he thinks, are the spur to human greatness. Belief, he writes, in an immaterial and immortal principle united for a time to matter is so necessary to the greatness of man that it produces beautiful effects even when it is not accompanied by a belief in divine rewards and punishments or a concern for what happens to the soul after death. The belief that the soul survives the body, even if it goes into the body of a pig the next time around, Tocqueville thinks is an improvement over not having a soul at all. This, he says, was enough to give Platonic philosophy the sort of sublime spark that distinguishes it. It's no wonder, he writes, that the writings of the ancient materialist philosophers have mostly come down to us only in part. No one made the effort to preserve a philosophy that so degraded human beings. Another problem, the fourth, is individualism. I'm looking at you. Another less abstract danger that Tocqueville foresaw in democracy was individualism. By individualism, he did not mean the rugged self-reliance and independence generally that we associate with that term. He meant the withdrawal of citizens from public affairs into the welcoming bosom of family and friends. And I point this out to my students all the time. You go back to your dorm room, you are on your floor in your dorm, there's a great championship game going on, but you're not going to go because you're just happy in your own little pod with your roommates and your small circle of friends. Maybe you'll order a pizza and watch a movie together. That's individualism. It's the withdrawal from public events, public affairs, it doesn't mean you're all by yourself. It means that you've just narrowed your scope to your close family and friends, and you're hanging out with them. At first, he says, this individualism suffocates only the public virtues. You're not public spirited if you're just sitting in your room with your friends and not getting involved in the larger world. But eventually it attacks all the other virtues as well and becomes nothing more than selfishness. For much of our history, individualism, as Tocqueville understands it, was not a danger in the United States because, owing to our free institutions and our marvelous art of association, Tocqueville stresses that so much in Democracy in America. Some peoples have a knack for associating with others. You want to get something done, there's not a vegetarian, socialist, feminist organization on the Princeton campus. You will associate with others and you will organize one. We know how to do this. Americans form associations for everything. And so this is what he describes, but it is much less so, as Robert Putnam discovered when he wrote his book, Bowling Alone. We don't go out and associate with others as much as we used to. There are many reasons why America has succumbed to individualism. Bureaucratic encroachment on local matters is a big one. It saps the desire to participate in civic associations. If you are told you can't do it any other way because the money is flowing from Washington down through the states to your local school in your town, then what's the point of getting involved in school matters? Because you can't change them because you have no real control over things anymore. The entry of women into the workforce has also deprived local organizations of their time and talent. I'm certainly not here to criticize women who go to work, but the fact that So many of them have gone to work, has left the public square denuded of a lot of its energy and its effort. And we have to find some way to recreate that if we can. And finally, the rise of the internet, which is a huge culprit, has made the withdrawal into one's own cocoon not only possible, but addictive. And a lot has been written on the addictive qualities of, watching YouTube videos or just whiling away hours and hours of your life glued to your device. Yet with this withdrawal from public and even social life, individuals feel themselves to be even weaker and more isolated, incapable of action. In their frustration, what do? They turn to government to solve their problems. One need only recall the Obama campaign ad, The Life of Julia, which depicts the character's dependence on a suite of government programs for every stage of her life. Moving right along to the fifth danger, bureaucratic despotism. The rise of the liberal administrative state, which in our country really begins full bore with the New Deal, although Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were early forerunners of it, poses a whole new set of dangers to the democratic republic. Tocqueville in Volume 1 of Democracy in America talked about the problem of majority tyranny. And he gives examples of an energetic majority tyrannizing over minorities. And in fact, it's in that context that he discusses the expulsion of the Indians from their tribal lands and also slavery. But when he turns to Volume 2, written 5 years later in 1840, he ends Democracy in America with a whole fourth section in which the highlight is what kind of despotism democratic nations have to fear. And here, Tocqueville predicted that democratic government would centralize administrative power over local objects. So what Tocqueville does in Democracy in America is to distinguish government power, which should be centralized, and administrative power, which should be localized. And administrative power now is increasingly sucked into the center. And so you lose power not only in government, but also over the administration of local affairs. He imagined what he called an immense tutelary power looming over what he described as a crowd of like and equal men, each pursuing his own small and vulgar pleasures. This power would be, and I quote, absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, and mild. It would resemble paternal power if, like that, it had for its object to prepare men for manhood. But instead, it aims, quote, to keep them irrevocably fixed in childhood, enjoying their private pleasures. To keep them safe and secure, it smothers them in a network of small, complicated, painstaking, uniform rules. Is anyone thinking of the Department of Motor Vehicles here? That reduces them to a herd of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. Nothing could be more fatal to liberty and republican government than this supposedly benevolent despotism that removes from its citizens even the need to think. When Tocqueville wrote these words, he was not thinking of America, but of France. Much to his regret, even after the Revolution of 1848 and the establishment of the Second French Republic, France remained a highly centralized state where all issues were decided in Paris. He observed in his recollections or souvenirs that the one thing that the French would never give up no, they would have a republic, but they would never give up centralization. He said it ruefully. He was not happy about it, but it turns out that it was true. By contrast, since the founding and roughly up to the New Deal and after, federalism and administrative decentralization, which pertains to local matters like school and safety and where the traffic signs are going to go and so on and so forth, were the order of the day in America. So it made sense to go to those local town meetings because you actually could get something done. However, starting with the progressives and moving on to the New Deal, and finally with the creation of new super-regulatory agencies in the 1970s, the United States has built up a powerful administrative state that has drawn to itself powers that either historically belonged to the states and localities or has assumed vast new powers altogether. One area where the federal bureaucracy has taken over state and local responsibilities is education. Bolstered by a powerful teachers' union, the Department of Education has resisted parents' demands for school choice and imposed policies that many parents strongly oppose, including keeping the schools shut for 2 years. It has pushed a woke agenda from pre-K through high school and beyond, so that when my students arrive as freshmen at Bowdoin College, they already have their views formed. They're just looking for reaffirmation of them, but they come with very strong views, which is probably not great. You wish that they would learn something new and get richer, more complex understanding of how the world works. It has compelled colleges and universities that receive federal funds to conform to its agenda. Not that colleges and universities needed much encouragement in this respect. Is it any wonder then that our college-age students are drawn to socialism? The federal bureaucracy has also expanded its reach to areas of American life never before regulated. Much, though not all, of this expansion has been carried out through the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which regulates environmental pollutants and oversees regulations regarding clean air, clean water, waste management, chemicals, and toxic materials, among other things. And don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to regulating these things. But we have gone very far in the regulation of this. And here I just take a little detour to tell you that when I was writing my book on Theodore Roosevelt, Roosevelt in 1907 declared conservation, which is climate change, environmentalism, famines in raw materials, as he called it, the great moral issue of the day. And he explained in his autobiography that that conservation would be the means by which the federal government could encroach on private property rights, but without all the socialism and all of the revolutionary fervor of communism and more radical economic plans. So conservation and later environmentalism, there's a long history here in which it's not just about solving discrete problems of cleaning up, in my state, the Androscoggin River so that logs are not floated from Canada down through the whole state of Maine. But it's more about, it's a moral crusade. And you can certainly, I think, see that with climate change today. So the EPA is really, in many ways, the center of this whole movement. And what really gave it an additional boost was in 2009, when President Barack Obama signed what he called an endangerment finding, and which President Trump has just repealed by executive order. And of course, this is going to be in the courts for the rest of our lives before it gets worked out. But This endangerment finding provided the EPA with a basis for expanding its efforts to combat climate change, which was by then no longer a merely scientific matter, but one of the great moral issues of our time, along with racism. And here I'll give you another example from my own public service, and that was when I was serving on the National Council of the National Endowment for the Humanities. When the Biden administration came in, every president announces these are priorities that we would like to see scholars and public institutions, public-facing institutions, pay some attention to. In the first Trump administration, it was military history. When President Biden came in, it was climate change. This is the humanities, climate change and racism. These were the programs that would be given a green light to go ahead. These were the things they were looking to fund. And so as part of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which included the Green New Deal, the EPA received over $54 billion to combat climate change and related progressive goals, such as addressing environmental racism and climate justice. So you see the way in which climate change, which you would think would be scientific, has taken on a whole moral, ethical, political dimension to it. The Green New Deal also offered tax credits for renewable energy investments in solar and wind, which again, President Trump, in one of his latest explosions of feeling about this, has just called it the biggest scam in the whole climate change world. So credits for renewable energy investments in solar and wind while discouraging the use of fossil fuels. For those who commuted long distances to work or depended upon their heavy-duty trucks for their livelihood, the Green New Deal was an unaffordable luxury and an intolerable restriction of their personal freedom. You can't get in the car and drive to see grandma in Nevada or Chicago if there are no charging stations and all you have is an electric car. So clearly this was meant also to keep us from thinking that we should, this is America. You get in your car and you go places. I don't, but a lot of Americans think that's their God-given right to get in a car and drive across the country. And for them, the fact that you would be shoved into these EVs where there were no charging stations and you were lucky if you could go to the local supermarket and back and maybe to see your kids play a soccer game, and then you'd be out of fuel or your charge would be gone, was not, people responded, especially in Maine, because so many people in Maine are self-employed plumbers, electricians, and so on. And all you see on the roads are these big honking trucks. And, and their whole life is carried around in those trucks. So for them, it was a real restriction of their personal freedom. It was precisely the kind of democratic despotism of which Tocqueville had warned. Yet, as we have come to see, Tocqueville's warning did not fully anticipate the present danger with administrative despotism. Bureaucratic rules, he wrote, hinder, enervate, daze, but they do not tyrannize or destroy those who get in their way. Rather, they aim only at softening wills and making men more pliable. But we have seen how the surveillance state, put in place after the attacks on September 11th, has been turned against political opponents and American citizens. The IRS investigation of the Tea Party, the use of the FBI, the CIA, and the Office of National Intelligence to concoct in advance what is now widely revealed to be the Russia hoax, the corruption of the Justice Department and the use of lawfare to keep Donald Trump from running for office, the government's coercion of social media to suppress dissent, and most recently, the debanking of prominent citizens, including but not limited to the Trump family, reveals the far more sinister aspects of an unaccountable, irremovable, and anonymous bureaucracy now turned against its domestic political opponents, rooting out the overreach and corruption of the administrative state, as well as returning some of these powers to the states and to the people, is crucial for preserving our Republican form of government and our way of life. Finally, one more. The question of democratic greatness. So far, Tocqueville has warned of the dangers free countries such as ours must strive to avoid. But what of the heights to which we may aspire to ascend? When he toured the United States in 1831, Tocqueville was struck by how rare it was to see men of great ambition. Having never experienced aristocratic grandeur, Americans seldom allowed their imaginations to soar, but stuck close to the ground. Observing the mediocrity of desires of men whose lives were taken up with what he called the small, incessant occupations of private life. And again, when you don't inherit a huge fortune that is yours by virtue of your being the 10th Duke of Omnium, you have to work. Tocqueville feared that ambition would lose its spark and its greatness. At the same time, he recognized, as the young Abraham Lincoln did, and at almost the exact same time, that occasionally a man of outsized ambition might arise, posing his own unique dangers. When faced with the loss of power, such a man might be tempted to overthrow the government to maintain his grip. Sound familiar? It should, because this is what Donald Trump's opponents argued after January 6, 2021. However, rather than seize power, Trump left office peacefully, though not graciously, on January 20th. Tocqueville saw yet another problem with the man of irregular ambition. Because his eyes are fixed on the present, he tends to focus on short-term projects that leave no lasting monuments to greatness. Success, not glory, is his aim. Not only are his ambitions low, but so also are his manners and morals. The mores of such men, and I'm quoting again, have almost always been less high than their condition, which very often makes them bring very vulgar tastes to extraordinary fortune, and they seem to raise themselves to sovereign power only to procure small and coarse pleasures more easily. It is not difficult to see why Trump's opponents ridiculed his signal campaign slogan emblazoned on his red baseball cap, "Make America Great Again." What would a New York builder and playboy famous for his gold toilets know about democratic greatness? It turns out rather a lot. During his first, but not everything. During his first electoral campaign, Trump promised to bring big reforms in both international and national affairs, though his efforts were hobbled first by the Russia hoax, then impeachment, and finally COVID. His first 6 months as the 47th president of the United States, although we're coming up on the first year since the election, suggests that this time Trump is prepared to take big risks and advance long-term goals both abroad and at home. In international affairs, he has made himself a champion of peace, using American power to try to resolve conflicts in war-torn areas around the globe. At the same time, he has made clear to European leaders that after 80 years since the end of World War II, they must assume greater responsibility for their own security. America must now focus on China. Closer to home, he has revived the Monroe Doctrine to muscle enemies of freedom out of the New World. Finally, he has renewed American interest in space exploration, not only to the moon, but Mars, a long-range and perilous undertaking if ever there was one. In domestic affairs, Trump has quoted lines from Theodore Roosevelt's famous speech given in 1912, Citizenship in a Republic. He gave it in France, in which he cast himself as the man in the arena, willing to take on corruption in government and fight for the interests of working men and women of all creeds. He has made citizenship an element of his domestic policy, rounding up those in the country illegally and making character an important consideration in granting American citizenship. He has vowed to end the ideological indoctrination of America's school children, even if it means shutting down the Department of Education, and make them once again proud of their country, especially as we approach this momentous anniversary next year. What would Tocqueville make of this moment? As he reflected on his American visit, Tocqueville predicted that the people of the United States, whatever they do, will become one of the greatest peoples in the world. But it would be the kind of greatness and happiness proper to America. During his visit, Tocqueville marveled at Americans' commercial talents, finding in their efforts to sell tea for a penny less than their English competitors a kind of heroism. And he talked also about how the French just wanted to stay by their hearth and home and not do anything, whereas the Americans were always lighting out for the territories, taking risks. This was the difference between the French and the American cultures. Their commercial superiority, however, could not be explained merely in material terms. Rather, it was owing to Americans' moral and intellectual qualities. Let me close with a few words on this last point. American greatness will never lie simply in the accumulation of wealth, though Americans have succeeded mightily in this capacity. The real greatness of America lies in her ability to transmit to future generations the moral and intellectual virtues that undergird her material success. Audacity and risk-taking have made Americans wealthy. Love of liberty and belief in God have made them free. Tocqueville himself gives eloquent testimony to this sublime longing for freedom when he writes in the closing pages of his great work on the old regime. This is going to be a long quote. I have often wondered what the source of this passion for political freedom is, which at all times has made men do the greatest things that humanity has accomplished, in what feelings it is rooted and nourishes itself. Freedom, he explains, is not merely independence, which seeks only to throw off a master, rather than hating the far greater evil of subjection itself. An important point to keep in mind as we celebrate our Declaration of Independence. Maybe we need a Declaration of Freedom. Preserving our freedom is the responsibility of every generation. He then adds in words of surpassing beauty, that which in all times has so strongly attached certain men's hearts to freedom are its own attractions, its own peculiar charm, independent of its benefits. It is the pleasure of being able to speak, act, and breathe without constraint under the government of God and the laws alone. Whoever seeks for anything from freedom but itself is made for slavery. Certain nations pursue freedom obstinately through all kinds of perils and miseries. They consider freedom itself a good so precious and so necessary that no other could console them for its loss. Others tire of liberty in the midst of their prosperity. They let it be taken from them without resistance, for fear of compromising the very well-being that they owe to it. What do they lack to make them free? What? The very desire to be so. Do not ask me to analyze this sublime desire. It must be fully felt. It enters of itself into the great hearts that God has prepared to receive it. It fills them. It fires them. One must give up on making this comprehensible to the mediocre souls that have never felt it. Here, in this passage, is the special reason why Tocqueville expects America will achieve a distinctive democratic form of greatness. If, therefore, America is to become truly great again, her leaders will have to do more than they have done so far. They will need to fortify those mediating institutions, especially the family, the schools, and religious associations that develop those qualities of soul, especially the love of freedom, that is the wellspring of democratic greatness. Democrats ignore at their peril that the soul has needs that must be satisfied. The task ahead, then, will be to strengthen all that elevates, enlarges, and extends the soul, while resisting all that enervates, debases, or dismisses it. For ultimately, there can be no real American greatness unless the American soul remains great and strong. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jean. We have plenty of time for some questions. We have some microphones that will come around when you're called upon. Please wait for them to reach you before beginning. And any students who wish to get into the queue to ask a question will be immediately put into the front per the JMP custom. Who would like to begin? Yes, right here.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm going to ask a question that, of course, was not part of your talk, which is, okay, then what? What I mean by that is with the last quote that you gave where, if Tocqueville is lamenting or the potential future loss of family, association, school, and even the township, in this day and age, in this world that we're living in, I'm curious if you've given any thought to, okay, now what? If we are sort of in the despotic, sort of that move towards deterioration.
Well, I ended by saying we have to strengthen those mediating institutions. And that means in part giving these Sorry, I'm a prisoner. We have to strengthen those mediating institutions by giving them more running room so that they can actually get things done. If you have a PTA or you have a school board meeting or people want to see a more balanced curriculum, I think that was one of the things that became so clear during the 2 years that students were home. And the parents, everybody was home, locked up in their little cages during the COVID years. And so you could see what was going on in the classroom. And I think there's just a lot of ferment in there that we don't, you look around and you say, why do so many young people think socialism is better than capitalism or free enterprise? It's not, I'm not a libertarian. I'm not in any way a libertarian. But I think that we need to address the kind of instruction that kids have been receiving and the lack of parental supervision in many cases. So in some way, we do need to have a cultural and political revolution, but you have to feel that it's worthwhile, that if you are going to take on your school board, that you have a reasonable chance of success in it. And that means, in some way, making it not a question of federal dollars flowing only if you adopt certain policies that are, that you regard as detrimental to the health and life of your child. So it's again, when Tocqueville talks about the spread of democracy, he starts by the decision in the 700s to let commoners enter the priesthood, that it was no longer just for the nobles. And it took, he's writing in 1830, so it's 1100 years that democracy has been slowly working itself out. This is not the work of a day. But I think for me, I think the most important thing is just getting people to think about how far we've come, how quickly we've come in this direction of ceding control over ourselves and our local institutions. So I just think you start with raising awareness, which we used to talk about when I was a college student, raising awareness. But now we have to raise awareness of just how much we've lost, not just, the things that we've gained. I'm sorry, I don't have an action to do plan.
David, please.
Hi, can I ask a follow-up on this, which is, you mentioned, so we've seen that there's been a ceding of this individual autonomy and collective autonomy at the local level of government, township, or state. And you brought out, I think, beautifully the ways in which the centralization of the and growth of the administrative state has done that. But I wonder which way it flows, whether it goes, the state collects power and then the people cede it, or whether it's not a two-way street where the people themselves, and like Tocqueville describes, they're increasingly willing to be school children with the schoolmaster. And so, I'd love to go back to the mediating institutions that Tocqueville speaks of, but I wonder if the problem doesn't run deeper, that it isn't just the EPA and the Department of Education, but the people themselves no longer have the will or even the desire to do it, and so those travel together. And so it strikes me then that, it'd be great to have public policies that devolve power back to the local townships and communities, but where's the people to take that up? And, you can talk also about, the exodus from township to city, like who wants to live in upstate New York when they can live in Manhattan? And it's
They can't afford to live in Manhattan.
No, but they live there. I mean, you know what I mean?
I do, of course I do. I think your point is a very good one, and not surprisingly, Tocqueville also got to that. I mean, it's really hard. He's so far-seeing in so many ways that he does anticipate that, and he says one of the most insidious things is that, and this is a kind of inversion of what President Ronald Reagan said, which is the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." But Tocqueville said that first, and he said one of the things that is so extraordinary is that people actually believe that the government tells you they're putting these policies in place in order to make your life easier. But what they've really done is strip you of your adulthood, your responsibility, your will, and then you become much more passive. And when I don't think we are at the stage where we're passive. I think, in fact, we've seen a lot of fight and a lot of gumption over the last 10 years, and even longer. I don't think that we're as worn down as you might think, but one has to, again, constantly renew those sources of efficacy, where you feel that if you do something, it will really matter. And every generation has to do that. I think we're in much better shape than other countries because we do have, we don't take this stuff so lightly. We do have a certain revolutionary streak in us. It's not just the people of New Hampshire with their flag that says "Don't tread on me." But there's a certain part of that in the American character which makes it more difficult to go too far. But what you see, and I don't mean to be partisan about this, I hope that you could see by the end that I don't think that that just material success is what makes America great. I think material success is necessary. It's hard to work when people are starving or feeling somehow that they got gypped, they got the short end of the stick. But it's not material. It's a certain these are certain passions that are deeply embedded in the character of the American people, that they just are not going to be bossed around too much. Now, and there are always going to be some who think that, more supervision, the pizza box that comes and it says, don't eat the box. I mean, do we really need to be told not to eat the box when the pizza comes in it? There's just a limit to how far you have to go in infantilizing grown-up men and women. And I think the more we make fun of those things, the more we reject them, the better we're going to feel. And that's a good start.
MJ.
Not to be a doomer, but are we sort of in a Tocquevillian sub-basement? You were talking about, and I'm sure you're like,
This is like the myth of the cave,
yeah,
and
yeah.
we're in the cave beneath the cave.
Sub-cave. Yeah, maybe. Because you were talking about how for individual, like the sort of retreat into family life is individualism, but Tocqueville, as you know very well, talks about the family also as something that can bring us out of ourselves, because you're stuck with your children, they're going to this local school, and you're like, all right, I'll take an interest in the school, I guess. Seems like it'll sort of work out.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like...
But then you go to
yeah.
the meeting. You go to the,
Yeah.
I did that. I had children, and I would go in and see the teacher and say, why aren't they doing this? And they could be doing that. And why aren't they? And you get this whole runaround and rigmarole. And they tell you, if you don't like the way we're doing it, take your kids out and put them in private school. It's not a good attitude.
That does certainly seem like a problem, but also fewer and fewer people are getting married or having children. And so even like the family, which at least pulled you out of yourself a little bit, like it seems like even that is sort of falling away, isn't it? Or like on the decline as an institution. So this is my question. Are we in the Tocquevillian sub-basement?
There are people who study those things, since I have my nose in the books of the politics and the Nicomachean ethics and political philosophy. And this is always a problem. You have, the pie in the sky theorists, and then you have the nuts and bolts people who hate the theory people because they don't know what they're talking about. And how do you bring them together? But you have someone like Charles Murray, who wrote that book, Coming Apart. Or there's a fellow in, I think his name is Goodhart in England, who wrote about the somewheres and the nowheres. The anywheres, the somewheres and the anywheres, or the nowheres, that we have produced at our top universities and colleges, students who do regard themselves as global citizens. They very quickly fall in with foreign mores. They think anything that is not of their own country is exotic and exciting. And then you have the people who stay home. But as Charles Murray said, and they stay home. They don't move far away. It's only my children who don't live in the same state that I live in because of the way that I raise them. And you see the downside of that they have, great professional jobs, but we're not as close a family as we would be if we all lived in the same town. I talk to people all the time who say, all 5 of my children live within 6 miles of me. And then they say, where do your children live? And don't. It's embarrassing. So that's one side of it, that our top universities, because we stress so much having these glamorous and successful jobs, but most people really choose to go to local colleges and universities because it's just, they want to be near their families. Now, as for family structure itself, yes, that is in a much more dangerous condition. And Charles Murray has written about that. And what he said is that for the educated people are getting married. It's the it's the non-college. So on the one hand, the non-college people are not corrupted. They still think America is a good place, but they're not getting married, and they've got all these kids out of wedlock. And then you've got the other group, which is, they are getting married, but they don't really, they're not all that in love with their own country. So we have different problems that we need to address with different sectors of the population. And we need to do thinking. That's not the kind of stuff that I do, but I think about it, but I don't have any, professional advice to give, except that you should get married and you should try to stay together as a family and not go so far from your dear mother. It's my grandson's birthday today.
Avery, was your hand up? Pass the mic one more time.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question about sort of Aristotle's place in your project. You mentioned this sort of funny thought that because of the discovery of representation, I think you said Jefferson said this, we can sort of dismiss all of Aristotle's thinking. And one of the things,
Well, it's typical of Jefferson to
Right.
say something so outrageous.
Sure. And one of the things that strikes me is that for Aristotle, politics is on the one hand the good arrangement of offices, but also it's the fulfillment of our inherently political nature, by which is sort of a more famous part of book one, but he then goes on to say, and what that means is, unlike the animals who speak only of pleasure and pain,
They
we
can
have-
speak about justice.
Yeah, justice and injustice and the good and the bad. I was wondering if the current condition of American representation gives people, in your view, the ability to feel as if their considerations of the just, the unjust, the good and the bad are being sort of given in speech to the people that they live with? Or, because on the one hand, people's opinions are very much out there these days. People have all sorts of outlets to say what they want to say, but also it kind of feels as if something is lacking in the character of that discourse. So I was wondering if you could say more, maybe via Aristotle, what you think about this.
You've hit on a hobby horse of mine. It may not be central to your question, but up until Theodore Roosevelt, every president wrote his own speeches. Now you have, a representative in Congress. Nobody can write a speech anymore. I don't know what they've learned that doesn't fit them, prepare them in public life to be able to speak fluently and, if not deeply, at least sensibly about issues without worrying that if they speak off the top of their heads, they'll say something stupid. And they probably will. I mean, we have really degraded this so much so that the speechwriters are so important. So as to the question of, does representation, the Madisonian Federalist view of representation is, even in 1787, you can't possibly represent every single different viewpoint, even in districts that were only one for every 30,000, 40,000 per congressman. Now it's 725,000 people. This is our closest branch of government. And, the alternative would be to increase the size of the Congress so that you'd have 2,000 representatives, but they'd have a smaller number of constituents. There isn't the problem of creating a deliberative space is difficult enough when you have 725,000 people, and you don't have people who've really prepared for public life. I mean, they may have ambition, but it doesn't seem that they have much of a vision or much ability, really, other than glad-handing people. Can they really sit down? And it would be interesting to trail them around. My senators, I think, are fairly thoughtful, Susan Collins and Angus King. But some of them are clearly just showboats. And, they get, again, you have this is a problem with democracy. People are taken in by superficial appearances and by, you sell a congressman the way you sell a car. And to be aware of that is, again, I think it really comes back to education, of what you learn. I mean, if we'd be better off teaching Schoolhouse Rock. It's just that what you need to have is a new issue, a new episode that shows you that in addition to the three branches of government, which are subject to the separation of powers and to federalism, we have a bureaucracy that overrides both the separation of powers and federalism, because you have an EPA at the federal level, you have an EPA at the state level, you have local, mini EPAs at the, and everybody's just siphoning off the money from the top. So I think that kind of bureaucracy, having a bureaucracy that really in some sense is at loggerheads with the whole constitutional design, which is for limited but energetic government. And you cannot have an energetic government when you're asking government to do everything. Just think of it in terms of a human body. If I ask you just to learn, looking at you, I'm going to say, take up track, because you seem to, you could run and you could be fast and you could excel. All right, take up swimming. Okay, all right, take up swimming. Not football. I wouldn't recommend football. But if I ask you to become an athlete in every single sport, and in addition become a great chef and also, an actor, your energy is going to be so dispersed over everything. You have to have core things that you're good at. And if you try and do everything, you're not going to do them well. And I discovered this when I'd been teaching for a long time, but I was not aware of just that we have two different systems of government at work. You have the three constitutional branches, which are limited by the Constitution, and then you've got the bureaucracy, and they don't follow the separation of powers. They make the laws, they execute the laws, and they judge the laws. So that, for instance, if you wind up being audited on for your tax returns, you don't go to an Article 3 court to protest it. You get a special IRS court. And the IRS is the one that's judging you and executing the law and making the final decision on whether you have cheated on your taxes. So it's deliberate, that the early progressives, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, this was not a party issue, both thought that the limited government and separation of powers were too restrictive. And they looked for a way to get around that. And the way to get around that was with an administrative offices that would not be bound by the separation of powers and federalism. And, that's I think just coming to know that and let that sink in, it would be very useful if students learn this. It's shocking when when you read about what students don't know. I mean, it's a famous test, and I gave it a couple of years, maybe 10 years ago, where you ask students questions about American history. And more students nationally, not at Bowdoin, but nationally, knew who Snoop Doggy Dogg was than what the Battle of the Bulge was. Clearly we have our priorities upside down and inside out. So I would say just knowing how our system works, because it's easier to address some of the drawbacks and dangers if you understand it. But as Chuck Schumer said, you mess with the intelligence community, and they have 6 ways to Sunday to screw you. It was his words, and he was right. So there is this danger there that, you have these public facing institutions and then you have anonymous. We don't know who works in these bureaucracies. They have civil service protections. They don't run for office. They are unaccountable. We may not like what their decisions are, but they keep rolling along. And they're the ones who really have far too much power in our government.
Well, I'm afraid on that gloomy note, we've come to the end of our time.
No, but just knowing what the problems are is hugely liberating. I just want
Well,
to.
that's a good note to end on. Knowledge is
All right,
liberating.
okay.
Thank you, James.